Concert, so I kind of can't hear it from the radio.
What time is it there?
What time is it there?
You probably can't hear. What time is it there? Can you hear us?
I think when he put his headphones in, he couldn't hear us anymore.
Huh?
Can you hear us?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. All right.
We all want to know what time it is, though.
We all want to know what time it is there.
It's 10 at night, and I was just at a punk concert, like all the critical animal studies scholars. And I can't really hear out my radio too well, because
Okay.
2 nights ago I was at another one, so.
I'm gonna introduce you real quick and then we'll get started.
Okay.
All right. So this is Dylan Hellenstein O'Brien. He's a student at Hamline University. He's previously presented at several conferences, including the 2013 and 2014 North American Conferences for Critical Animal Studies. His academic work focuses on the intersections of disability and non-human animals in literature, and he was awarded a research grant this past summer to examine Japanese erotica featuring non-human animals. Tell you.
Huh?
Pretty good. Go.
Oh, Here, let me start my little stopwatch so I'm good. Because unless Carol has like really awesome cards to tell me I'm running overtime.
I do.
Okay, well, I'll still start the timer and I can like feel guilty about it. Okay. Actually, wait, Carol, did they change my presentation title to the one about gender response?
No, that which can never be eaten, exceptional meat, and the reinforcement of everyday consumption.
Okay, well, I had emailed somebody about switching the topic. Anyways, I'll just, so the paper that I'm going to be giving today is a bit different, but hopefully more interesting. This paper is about teaching a unit of critical animal studies in Japan and the response to that. Yeah, and so I'm going to get started. I have the paper here, and I'm going to kind of just read parts that I think I wrote really well, but most of the time I'm just going to kind of wing it. So yeah. What the paper is about in general, and what I want to talk about is teaching a unit on critical animal studies this past winter semester here in Japan in an introductory level film studies course in Japan, specifically the Tohoku region, northern Japan agriculture. The entire approach of the course was looking at otherness in film and what are the forces that other humans and with the non-human animal unit, the choice was to look at how non-human animals or other bringing in, because it was one of the later units in the courses, bringing in how the forces that we already talked about with the class had be done to other non-humans in the same way. I was the one that designed and I delivered the lecture for the non-human animal unit. The main instructor for the course was Darren Ashmore, who I co-wrote the paper with. The main author in the paper is me. And so I'm presenting on sort of behalf of the two of us, but since I'm going to be talking mainly about kind of the critical animal studies approach, that'll be what I'll talk about. So part of why we feel this is important, what we did, and the idea of teaching critical animal studies approach to film and looking at issues of non-human animal otherness, is that so far what we've seen in critical animal studies, and to a degree human animal studies and animal studies, is a focus on literature, specifically like written books, and also films that can be unequivocally read as pro-animal or anti-animal. Looking at things like, The Cove. Like, we all know what The Cove's about, and there's been some really excellent writing on The Cove. but at the same time, at the end of the day, we all know what the quote's about, and we all know that your grandma's probably not going to go to the store after Thanksgiving and be like, let's all go rent the toad. There's things that are very clearly pro-animal and very clearly anti-animal, and I think there's an importance in looking at more of the gray area, and so that's kind of what we did. I'm going to try and run through the construction of the overall course, which is the section that Darren wrote a lot with me because obviously he was kind of the key architect of the course. The course as a whole, we chose films that presented otherness in some format, but didn't necessarily have it as the key thing, and that films weren't necessarily overtly political in nature. This was something we wanted to be sure of because Darren has experience teaching in Japan for many years, and his big concern, and this is again drawn off of numerous sociological commentary and anthropological commentary on Japan and otherness, and that there's not necessarily a functioning definition of what a sociological minority is in Japan, especially in a more rural area like this. And so the decision was to pick films that could really ease people into discussing what is otherness. For instance, the first film was actually Mad Max 2. And we picked these films because then it allowed the students to really think on themselves, what is otherness? How is otherness fluid for us, boundaries? Because even before the animal unit, an intersectional approach was key, and it was how is otherness moving across these boundaries? How is Wes, who is read as gay in Mad Max, how is he oppressed in this way? And the students really picked it up and ran with it. In Mad Max in particular, there's some really great analysis on behalf of the students that they were critical of the fact that Wes was so overtly gay for the time. They read it as him being a laughing stock. So, but again, the animal unit fits in that we picked a film, Watership Down is the film, sorry, I should have said that right at the beginning, as that we wanted to pick a film that wasn't necessarily political and that otherness was in, but it was something they were going to have to bring their critical lens to. I'm going to kind of jump over the part where I talk about why Watership Down was chosen specifically. The key part for Watership Down in that we initially didn't want to do an animated film, and we were really struggling with that because we were worried that students would write it off as it's animated, so it's childish, and so that was a key concern. And I'll return to that later because ultimately that did happen. But we went with Watership Down because there's a lot of great writing on it. Specifically, Marie Hauser has a piece that was published on the internet in which she talks about the power of literature from a critical animal studies and feminist perspective and addresses Watership Down. And for me and Darren both, that piece was a really good selling point on why to use Watership Down. There's also the fact that it hooks people in. It's an exciting film, and a lot of the other films we could have chosen about animals that have otherness and aren't overtly political are kind of out there and might not resonate so much. And a lot of the films in the course it had been clear that the students, if they found the film exciting, whether it was Last of the Mohicans, we had True Grit, that the more exciting the better. And so it was decided to stick with that. In addition, there's the obvious fact that we drew on Hauser's piece theoretically, and Hauser's piece was assigned for reading to the students. And a key part of Hauser's argument for why Watership Down is important is that Watership Down, it doesn't so much humanize the animals as try to imagine from their perspective what life is like. And she argues, looking at Posey in particular, that a literary approach that's critical animal studies informed should try to see life from the non-human animal's perspective and not try to anthropomorphize them. So, quick, just to give people an idea of what the students then read after the film, because the structure of the course was on a Friday, students would view the film, and then following the viewing, we have a brief discussion, any questions would be answered, readings would be handed out, and then on the following Wednesday, we'd meet, there'd be a small lecture usually, and since it was a discussion-intensive course, students would break out into small groups and discuss. And that was usually where a lot of really rich ideas came. And then after that, they'd write papers, and the papers would be due the following Monday. And it was an 8-week winter-intensive course. And so the readings given were Marie Hauser's piece on water shutdown. It was a shorter piece. The opening chapter on equability from Anthony Nocella and the volume on equability, because he writes in a very accessible manner, and the institution this course was taught at, all courses are in English, even though it's in Japan, and the majority of students are Japanese by a far margin. And so we wanted to pick an accessible level of English because there had been some struggling with really high theory academic stuff that had been assigned, particularly in the feminist unit. And so we made that choice pretty early on. And so it was Hauser's piece, Nocella's piece, and then a selection from Tim Stocha, who's on this panel's book, on the avant-garde and animals. We took 2 subheadings from it, the section on childhood and terrorism from the introduction, because she so clearly talks about how in childhood people are impacted by imagery of animals. And we thought that was important given that this film had initially been targeted at children. The reason we decided to do the critical animal studies unit, or the looking at animals as others, was initially we had toyed with the idea that when we were planning the course in December and January. And we shied away from it because we thought there wouldn't be interest in it, and we thought that it would be, because we wanted to come at it from an intersectional angle, and we wanted to use feminist approach like Hauser and Kim do, and talk about, these forces that other in the same way. And we were worried that would be too theoretically heavy for an introductory level course, because a lot of, the students were taking this course because it was introductory level, basic education, and they probably saw film and thought it would be good. There's no film studies major here, and it's a very basic level course, and so we thought that it would just be better to not do it. But what happened is when we did the unit on women in film as others, we screened a film from Japan, Perfect Blue, by Satoshi Kon, which is pretty heavy. And there's a scene in which the girl who is being stalked, her pet fish have been poisoned and are dead when she arrives home. And some of the students were very visibly upset, particularly female students. And reading the essays, there was a really rich theoretical engagement with that scene in particular, and drawing in readings that they had been assigned and also things they had researched on their own. And people were really fixated on this scene where the fish had died and were really deeply upset by it. And after that, we thought that, particularly given there was just, anyways, the death of the fish was analyzed so well that we figured that it would be fine to revisit it, especially since there seemed to be this marked interest. And that a lot of the course was designed essentially to give students a pragmatic tool set to analyze their media consumption correctly. And that's what we wanted to do. And so we felt that given how underrepresented non-human animals are in discussion of film, that it would be a good idea to do this. So, following the film, essentially, in the audience, can people just raise their hand if they're familiar with water shutdown, so I know if I have to state it at all? Are people familiar with water shutdown? Okay. It was a film in 1978, adapted from Richard Adams' book, and both are kind of presumed to be aimed somewhat at children or adolescents. And essentially, Watership Down is about, I wouldn't really say, not buildings around, that's not the word I'm looking for, but there's essentially these groups of rabbits, and they have their own mythology, they have their own society, and this one rabbit has a vision of the impending destruction coming at the hands of humans. And the rabbits leave and they migrate to Watership Down, this really nice place, and are threatened by these other rabbits. And it's this whole journey, it's really well done, especially for animation 1978. And it's particularly famous for at the very end, there's some very brutal fighting between the rabbits, and a dog comes and eats several of the rabbits. And some of the students were pretty, there was sniffling and crying during the scene where one of the rabbits is shot by a human too. Some of the sniffling was on my behalf as always, but anyways, it essentially, to kind of summarize it briefly, I guess I should have assumed that he would be familiar, but it's essentially the journey of these rabbits in establishing an ideal home, an ideal place, and the trials they face. So following the film, right, because the readings from all the authors were in critical animal studies to some degree or another, right? And so the readings were handed up, and Darren and I asked, are there any questions about the film, about what you've seen? And there were really no questions seen. And so we said, okay, then we'll just meet again on Wednesday. And between Friday and Wednesday, people had time to read the articles, come back, whatever. And so when we sat down on Wednesday, we asked, are there any questions about the readings? Or do we just want to jump into discussion here? And so we jumped in, and somebody raised their hand right away, a female student, and asked specifically, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was along the lines of, where do the authors of these readings manage to get their protein? And it was somewhat jarring. Thank you. It was somewhat jarring for us for the first question to be about dietary choices. And we didn't want that to become the focus of the discussion. And on the Friday previously, we had said, please do not let your papers in any way be mainly about vegetarianism or veganism. That isn't the point. Like, Darren is a vegetarian and I'm vegan, and we were forthright about that. And we told people where we were coming from. And we said, but you don't need to think we're trying to make you go vegan. This is about animals as others. We want you to engage with that. You don't have. And the readings, while by critical animal space authors, in no way, shape, or form do we think we're necessarily telling people you have to go vegan or anything, and very far from it. And so, it basically, the class discussion, and it really just kind of de-evolved into a discussion of dietary habits. There's a single foreign student in the class from Russia who was very articulate about her beliefs and was a vegetarian and ended up feeling really in a awkward position because she was the only vegetarian student in the class and was really getting heat from her group, and when the class came back as a whole, she wasn't there. And so, since I'm down to 5 minutes, I'll say that in Q&A, if anybody has any questions on some of the really good analytical insight that the students did offer, I can speak to that. But I want to move into the main focus of the paper, which is kind of hilarious that I'm doing it this way. I'm really bad at preparing for stuff like this. But the main focus is the gendered response that happened. Obviously, and I hate using the idea of the West, but in the West, there's the idea of Carol Adams, the sexual politics of meat, of this gender prone to caring for animals, of whatever. And we really think that with this, both of us, me and Darren, especially me, have developed an interest in really pursuing looking at this further, because the way the responses were gendered was honestly staggering. A lot of the responses did address dietary choices. Some of the quotes that I have in the actual paper, which I can give to anybody if they want it, is one of the theses was, I intend to write about what makes it possible for us to kill and eat animals for the sake of our own survival. There's a paper titled The Difficulty of Vegetarianism, and a lot of that. So obviously that flew in the face of the response, or of what we had told them the responses should be about. Carnism was heavily justified, and a lot of this went back to a lot of the justification of carnism was happening with male students, and the male students specifically brought it back to an idea of being thankful for the animal. A number of students, male, brought in The Last of the Mohicans film that had been watched, which is about Native American people in the time of the French Indian War, and there's a scene in the beginning where they kill a deer, I believe, and the Native American characters give thanks for this. And a number of students specifically said that when they say itadakimasu, or thank you for this food, essentially, before eating, that it is the same as the Native Americans praying after killing a deer, and this acknowledges. The main kind of gendering occurred in that female students were more open to acknowledging that they were upset by what they saw, they're upset that animals are others, but that they feel trapped in that, I forget, we try not to do it about exact numbers, but a number of papers, I'd say more than 5 to be honest, were ended with female students being upset and saying, I really wish I could be vegetarian or vegan, but it's impossible, I can't do it. Society won't let me, whatever. And in very vague terms, they talk about being caught up in some system of oppression, which they weren't necessarily analyzing it like that, but they did speak to being caught up in this. Male students tend to, because basically a lot of the responses were about dietary habits, and they shouldn't have been because we said not to make them about that. But male students essentially would talk in pseudoscientific terms and would say that there's scientific reasons. These were never justified, of course. There's never citation. But a number of male students specifically said that animals are inferior and that's why it's okay. And there was a male student paper where the student basically said that what we were trying to teach was not important, it was worthless, because we were looking at it from the rabbit's perspective, and the rabbit's perspective does not matter because they are inferior, because they are not human. And so that was really hard. Since I'm kind of out of time, there's a lot of stuff I should have gotten to that I didn't, and that I can answer in Q&A, but something that came up a lot was students talking about the fact that they feel animal activists in the West, was usually the phrase, are racist towards Japan in terms of response to the consumption of whales and dolphins in certain parts of Japan. And that was a key hang-up for several papers, is that they believed that the writing that they were assigned reading was theoretically worthless to them because kind of in concluding, what I'd say is that there does seem to be a gendered response to non-human animal issues in Japan, and that this is something that people should explore further, not just in Japan, but in everywhere, and that as critical animal studies seeks to actually address speciesism, we really need to understand how speciesism functions in other parts of the world, other than just America or Europe, and we really don't have that right now. And I think it's critically important that we do, especially when we're looking at burgeoning, I wouldn't say in critical animal studies, but in animal studies and human animal studies, just a proliferation of optimistic readings of animals in text that may not be the case and may not be coming at it from a critical engagement with whatever culture they're written in. So I'll end on that, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So there's some technology, so give them a minute. So since you probably want to see their talks, what we're going to do is switch computers. Does that
Okay.
make sense? So I'm going to unplug you, but put the computer where so maybe you want to put you on mute.
Yeah, I'll mute myself.
And then I'll move this computer so you can see the other speakers. And we're going to hook up a different computer for them. Okay, will that work for you guys? If you present from that computer?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's good. And then I have to fix the camera too. Do you need sound?
I'm gonna actually be like standing here.
Okay, do you need sound?
No.
Oh, you're gonna be standing there.
Yeah, I figured, because I have to click through, so I have to move my.
It's not like that. Sorry. I just hadn't thought about. And do you want to present a video? Or do you just want? Is that good? That's good. Is this ready? Thank you. Now we need to move him so we can see where should we put him. In the center. Okay. Not like I don't want to do that. Okay, so this is Kim Socha, and her talk is titled On Vegan Atheology. Oh, good. It's correct this time. So, Kim Socha is author of Women, Destruction, and the Avant-Garde, a paradigm for animal liberation, and also Animal Liberation and Atheism, Dismantling the Procrustean Bed. I'm sure she will tell us what that means in the talk, perhaps. She's also served as contributing editor to Confronting Animal Exploitation, Grassroots Essays on Liberation and Veganism, and Defining Critical Animal Studies, a Social Justice Approach for Liberation. She's an animal advocate, social justice activist, and English professor.
So is it 20 minutes?
20 minutes. Okay, yeah.
So you can give me time, but I have the clock here as well. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. As noted, this talk is based on my book, which is this, Animal Liberation and Atheism. So I want to just go over terms and also explain what I mean by the title of this presentation, which is On Vegan Atheology. So, because I've been asked that by subsequent people. So I want to start just with basics, which people probably know. What is theology? Most understand it as the study and how humans should understand and act within the universe in light of God's relations with us and revelations to us. So I was introduced to the term atheology in Michel Onfray's Atheist Manifesto, which I highly recommend. And it literally means without or in opposition to theology. So taking the without perspective in atheology is an attempt through science and philosophy to understand and learn how to act within the universe through non-supernatural means. Taking the in opposition to stance, atheology seeks to expose the damage that often lies in the wake of religious texts, traditions, and authorities, while offering alternatives to those repressive customs. So I would consider Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Values, to be an atheological text, but it's a speciesist one, which I talk about in the book in much more detail than I will today, of the without and in opposition to kind. So as I'm not a scientist, I come from the discipline of the humanities, I consider this book to be more an in opposition to a theological text, but also one that seeks to expose a theological thinking that subversively makes its way into some of the writing of our premier atheologists, for lack of a better term. I also just want to briefly explain the subtitle of the book. People are familiar with Procrustes as a figure from Greek mythology who had an inn right by the gates to Hades, and he would invite people into his inn and fit them to his bed. If they were too short, he would stretch them out on a rack. If they were too long, he would chop off their limbs. And if anyone fit perfectly, he would just move them to another bed. So it's basically trying to make something fit where it really doesn't. And that's my argument, is that arguments for animal liberation, as I will define it from my perspective in a moment, religion is not suitable when you actually look at what religions say about animals. And that's pretty much all religions, so I'll begin with the caveat. It's very difficult, but I have to do it in a talk as short as this. And even somewhat in my book, I know there's danger in talking about Christianity, because it's all the same, or Buddhism. There are so many different facets of it. Just like animal rights activists, or I'm an animal advocate. That can mean so many things. So I might have to do some real general commentary, but I do try to acknowledge that in the text, that none of this is simple. So animal liberation, as I define it, which I think will help set the stage, is it's not this, where I think people get the idea, people who aren't activists sometimes think, it's not like a storming of the Bastille type of situation. Animal liberation is a process, and I think it's sometimes a glacial process, by which non-human animals are deemed by human animals to exist for purposes other than human ends. So when we liberate ourselves from that conception, animals will be liberated. It's not about escaping death in any way. Animals will die, we will die through whatever natural means. But it's for humans to stop thinking other animals exist to serve our purposes, which is bolstered by religion. So it's not like all the cage doors will be opened, but it's kind of an enlightenment period through which animals see non-humans differently. I mean, we've had some example of this throughout history. People of color, people with disabilities were long used as test subjects, and the standard medical view is people of color do not experience pain in the same way that white people do. They can tolerate more pain, and they were, up in the US, up until at least the 70s with the Tuskegee experiment, we've seen this happen. And people with disabilities were also treated that way. So I'm going to not introduce you, remind you of some terms, because I'm going to be pretty sure most people are familiar with these. So why is religion inherently capable of speaking to animal liberation as I defined it? And there's three terms that, again, I don't think will be new to anyone. Speciesism, it's a failure, and what I argue in the book is that all religions follow this track. I'm going to talk a bit about Eastern religions, which are often seen to escape. In the book, I talk about some indigenous traditions and paganism as well, which I just don't have time to discuss here. So it's a failure in attitude or practice to accord any non-human being equal consideration and respect. The other problem is anthropocentrism, the belief that human beings are the central, most important species on the planet. I would actually argue that at least Western religions are anthropomonic or monic, meaning anthropocentric means, okay, we're the center, but we're going to consider some other species. And we kind of do that, depending on the culture, and like we value dogs more than we do other animals. But I really think there's an element of anthropomonism in that really humans are what matters the most. And then hierarchy. I like this. Hierarchy is a very complex idea that I try to parse out more in the book and actually in some articles I've done after it to explain. But I like this idea. It's a system of human rankings based on force, with the threat of force. Domination hierarchies characteristically inhibit the actualization of higher functions, not only in the social system, but also in the individual human, and of course in the individual non-human as well. So we have ranking systems, which I probably don't have to lay out for people. It's not that, just that humans are better than animals. Certain animals are valued more depending on the culture that you first look at. So hierarchy in Western religion, this is the traditional view, and it's based in ancient Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, and Socrates as well, but I think more of Aristotle, developed this idea of a very rigid hierarchy. And this, although of course the ancient Greeks, seem very far removed in their ideas of God and gods, very different from the Christianity adopted this perspective, where we have, again, very rigid demarcations of, so it's like a ladder, one might say a pyramid, and this of course is a simplification as well, because traditionally there have been further historical divisions. Man has been divided, well obviously there's a division between man and woman, but man has then been divided into white or black and brown, with white above black and women. And then, so we kind of get this paradigm where man serves God, women serves man, people of color serve whites, and animals serve everybody. So that is the traditional way. I mean, it's certainly being raised Christian, that is the way that I was taught the world works. I was taught that it's what reality looks like. And I think we could also argue that this is the normalized view, that the average person, not at this conference, would kind of see things. But the thing is, even if, and I'll show you, when you remove all of the supernatural stuff and you are a secularist or free thought, those hierarchies still remain. So I'm going to critique the atheist movement as well. So I also want this to be somewhat, part of the reason I wanted to write the book as well is this movement from study after study that I've looked at is populated by secularists. They're atheists, agnostics, free thinkers. I just don't think about religion. So overwhelmingly, so that might not mean everybody in this room, but overwhelmingly, in anecdotal evidence, people are not religious in the animal rights movement. So we are fueling this movement, but the theological perspectives are usually coming from Christianity and some Eastern religions as well, although some core texts of the movement are written by atheists. And they critique religion. I was kind of waiting for that one book or piece that said animal liberation and atheism in the same unapologetic way that someone would say animal liberation and Christianity. So you're going to argue that Christianity lends itself to this. I'm going to argue that atheism, I believe, lends itself to this. And for many people, that was a direct connection in their life. So I kind of, if there's anything practical that I would want people to take from this as well, is if you're part of the secular community and you know other people who are critical of religion, of some of the damaging influences, this is the way to talk to them about why animals matter. And most people accept now, without question, the idea that they're creatures who have feelings. I just like this simple idea, simple but true, who have feelings both physical and emotional, and those feelings matter to them. So this is where I actually do address plants and plant sentience many people from the free thought community, they're not all of them, they're mired in science. So what can science tell us about the world? And I thought this was a great, this came out in 2012. There was a proceeding of the top neuroscientists who are not some of my favorite people because they do a lot of animal testing and vivisection, but still, it was overseen by Stephen Hawking, and they came up with this declaration, the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. It was written for the average person to understand. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique, that's my emphasis, in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. So this came out in 2012, and I think for people who do any work with animals or for animals, are like, well, of course, it really took all these top scientists to come up with this. But it's good to have in your back pocket when you're dealing with one of those traditional, maybe stereotypical atheists who say, you're not smarter than Stephen Hawking, so that's what he has to say about it, not that he's vegan. So this is something that we can all understand, and what I'll talk about more is these amazing ideas are arising out of the atheist movement, but they're not following through, I think, on their own ethical conclusions. So I think atheism, or whatever, secularism, however you want to look at it, is so primed to start adopting this new ethical paradigm for them. So I want to offer an alternative to the spectrum of being. So this would be, most people, almost all I would say, from the secular community would remove the supernatural, and what I want to look at is kind of like a continuum or a spectrum where, and even sentience is sometimes, this is a simplification because insects are probably low on the sentient scale, but the thing is, if you don't have to kill a bug, why do it? And then plants I talk about in the book, because that always comes up, more and more so now. People love to find just anecdotal evidence that plants feel pain, which of course we know if you care about plants, you should be vegan because we eat less plants than meat eaters do. So if we can reimagine what the world is, if I had the ability to do that, maybe I would have intertwined all of these elements as well, because we're all dependent on each other too. So I want to talk a bit about Eastern religions, which are often seen as the great alternative, the animal-friendly alternative to speciesism, anthropocentrism, and hierarchy. And when I did research for this book, I learned a lot as well. And I was specifically going to focus on Jainism. But there's a few concepts I want us to consider. Some of you, again, might be familiar, which is karma and samsara. So if one chooses not to eat non-human animals to avoid absorbing the fear and terror the animals felt before slaughter, that is absolutely better for animals, which is why Eastern religions are better for animals but not good enough, as I argue in the book. But it still does not change the perception of animals as beings with an innate right to bodily integrity. In fact, the animals are tacitly acknowledged as lower beings whose use or non-use can lead to higher states of consciousness. For the human, living in delusion and idiocy, and these are words I'm taking from the text, as a human will lead to rebirth within the non-human animal realm. So you can see these are kind of, even though it's a circle, it's still these rigid divisions between, and animals are clearly distinct from other species. So this might lead to less slaughter, less terror for animals, but animals are still seen as a means to a human end, albeit spiritual. It doesn't allow for that revisioning of what the purpose of other species are. And then samsara is the cycle of births and rebirths, which Buddhist and Hindu traditions, in those traditions, non-humans, being born as a non-human is considered a lower birth. Even some of the most animal-friendly texts will argue this. So Jainism, I argue, is a misunderstood religion. I'm kind of running out of time, but real quickly, it's a sect of Hinduism that is extremely, I mean, some Janes, you know, they wear, you might know this, they wear masks so they don't absorb microbes, and they walk with brooms, and some don't even have sex because it kills sperm. So I'm going to give you some examples of speciesism, anthropocentrism, and hierarchy. So human birth is the highest birth, from Christopher Chappell. With few exceptions, the Janes do not sentimentalize animals. Ultimately, the reason one respects animals is not for the sake of the animal, but for the purpose of lightening the karmic burden that obscures the splendor of the human soul. Non-humans who suffer in zoos, slaughterhouses, and research labs have brought the misery upon themselves because of misdeeds in former lives. So at least some Janes, as they see it, you should not rescue animals from places of confinement and torture because they, in another life, brought it upon themselves. So that's kind of might be, okay, you're not eating animals, but you're not actively trying to stop them from being hurt. Animals in severe pain should not be euthanized, again, because even though the animal's suffering, you would be killing. So it's all about, again, we're going back to this idea, it's about humans and how humans can benefit. So the promise of atheism, I kind of find encapsulated in Richard Dawkins before he wrote The God Delusion. And he's gone back and forth. He's not vegan or vegetarian, although he has said that's the most moral thing to do. I simply won't do it. So there's the promise and the problem with atheism. So what's so special about humans? The speciesist assumption that lurks here is very simple. Humans are humans and gorillas are animals. There is an unquestioned yawning gulf between them, such that the life of a single human child is worth more than the lives of all the gorillas in the world. Tie the label Homo sapiens to even a tiny piece of its sensible embryonic tissue, and its life suddenly leads to infinite, uncomputable value. Think of that hierarchy. But the melancholy fact is that at present, society's moral attitudes rest almost entirely on the discontinuous speciesist imperative. So we have this guy saying these amazing things, saying veganism is the best way to live, the most moral way to live, but just saying, oh, it's too difficult. He actually says that Richard Dawkins, you know, of all people, people with far fewer dispensations than him find the way to go vegan. And I critique him and Sam Harris and others in the book. So the problem with atheism, so secular activists see sexism, racism, nationalism as vestiges of religious domination. So why are animal liberation issues generally ignored by those in the secular community? And I would say the answer is from Michel Onfray, his words. Secular thought is not to Christianize thought, but imitate Christian thought. Couched in rational language, it nevertheless preserves the quintessence of the Judeo-Christian ethic. So you can give up religion, but you don't give up what religion has taught you about the world. Even if you were raised in an atheist community or atheist family, you still have that mentality, that view of the world. So I'm on my last slide, which is good because I just have 2 minutes. What can atheism bring to the table? Pardon the pun, for non-humans. Acknowledgement that humans are an animal species, not divine in any way. I mean, some religious people will acknowledge that as well, but atheists are more apt to do that. Rejection of supposedly sacred texts and practices that are inherently speciesist, hierarchical and anthropocentric. This allows for moral progress that does not seek the sanction of higher authorities. I think we have more wiggle room as secularists. Focus on lived realities, not past or future paradises or rebirths. So if we have just one life, and we know that other creatures just have one life, we need to spend our time helping those lives, those animals live lives, not of torture, but what nature intended, even if it's at the death of other animals in the wild. And it allows for a questioning of cultural norms that spring from religious traditions and thinking. All this questioning has led to progress in other areas, so I think that it could also, first of all, it already has led to progress, but it hasn't led to action. And it's very, the last thing I'm going to say, I'm done my presentation, is some of the top atheist thinkers are actually carrying on a very long tradition of when philosophers in the 18th century first started considering animals as moral beings in any way, what do we owe them, they would stop short, and Peter Singer notes this in Animal Liberation, when it came time to stop eating meat, they would kind of pull back from their own ethical conclusions. So I see that happening in the atheist movement, but the fact that they're even reaching those conclusions is promising. That's it.
Okay, I'm gonna move the camera. And I'm gonna move Dylan so he can see it. Can you see? Can you fix that so you can see? There's a lot of technology. Hold on, I'm gonna move the camera. You're gonna stay there, right, Stephen? Okay.
You can't move anything.
Can you Dylan see Stephen?
Yeah, there's some light coming in, but you can see the silhouette of Stephen.
He's an angel. Okay. Stephen Burke is currently a philosophy graduate student at Temple University whose research interests comprise the intersection and implications of philosophy, media, and biology. And the name of his talk today is Magical Environments and Animalistic Imagination, an anti-hierarchical study of animal image capacity.
Thank you. So I'm actually, it's really awesome to be at a conference where I don't feel nervous in this smaller room. I have to make a real addendum. I've been lost in some of those metaphysics recently, so I've been very philosophically centered in this paper. It's very theoretically inclined, and but I think it's important, especially for philosophy as a discipline, to take on these kind of questions because they're often on fringe issues. This idea of that both presenters have been talking about of human beings as the culmination of all of nature, I attribute in philosophical terms to this concentration on rationality, so the rational animal, and this is ultimately a problem most inherited in our day from the Enlightenment, especially the Cartesian framework of thinking. So, but this idea goes back to the Greeks, and specifically Aristotle. So, throughout this history, until some recent work, it's in philosophy, it's mostly carried out by phenomenologists, specifically Sartre, more so than anyone coming out of a Heideggerian framework, to take up the imagination as some kind of a deconstruction of reason. So, if we consider the imagination the most important faculty for human beings, rather than I mean, they both go hand in hand, and I don't want to make an over, generalization, but imagination with reason comprises us, but animals have perceptual imagination. So, and we shouldn't consider the imagination as a lesser faculty of ourselves. So the primary concern of this discussion is to explore some theories of the imagination, and I just want to touch on them briefly. This is a short presentation, so I'll say something about Aristotle's, and then I'll say something about, and then make a big jump to phenomenologists and oversimplify their account. But primarily this is to explore the relevance of rethinking humans' arrogance at being better and making a value judgment against or superior to the rest of the animal kingdom, including any kind of living being. And so, how does animal perception deconstruct our very notion of humanity in a broader context of nature? And how is this related to conceiving of a different kind of ethics? And I'm just alluding to that because I don't want to propose a really definite model of what this ethics would look like, but I think in kind of mimicking Kant to say where animals ought to be respected or living beings ought to be respected. I concentrate mostly on animals though. So for a brief theory, and I will get to this guy. I always have trouble pronouncing his name, Uexel, but that's just later. So in De Anima, Aristotle talks about Fantasia. De Anima, his work, it means on the soul, so he's talking about human perception and sensory perception. So there are ways that we have, so for him, imagination, which is Fantasia, are basically, you can think of them as lingering traces of what we normally observe in our perceptual world. We just can, through memory and abstraction, we can recall these images and bring them to the forefront of our perceptual worlds in the present. Dorothy Freda has a quote, but she basically, I was going to read it, but I think I'm going to abstain so I can move more quickly. But essentially for Aristotle, what you need to know is that he composed a hierarchy of the faculties of the soul, the human soul itself, and imagination comes on this really lower rung because it's essentially just sensory perception for Aristotle. So there's no real good capacity to it, or it doesn't really matter because it's just kind of lingering over our sensory perceptions. What really matters is reason and attaining the highest kind of knowledge, which you have to basically correct your imagination in order to do for Aristotle. So, thus, truth only comes for Aristotle through reason and attaining universal kinds of knowledge. So this becomes important because this kind of is, well, this is Aristotle's own inheritance from Plato, but it also sticks with the Western canon. Still, it's persistent. So he did give the image. I just want to note too that he did say that in his observations, he was also, for those who don't know, a rigorous biologist. So he just liked to observe the world, and he gave animals, gave it to them. He observed the imagination in animals, so he attributed them with some kind of capacity for imagination. So moving on, a really long time in the history of theory, I'm going to go to phenomenological accounts. So I'm skipping some. The biggest importance here that I'm kind of juxtaposing is the rationalists, so the Cartesians, with sort of Heidegger's account of Heidegger radicalized, and this is oversimplifying things, but radicalized the notion, the Cartesian framework, and that becomes very important. So phenomenological accounts attempt to discover the experience of the imagination along with the experience of everything in our everyday life, so in our life worlds. So perception now in our everydayness and our concern with the world becomes, what that means is we have a kind of, I don't want to say hierarchy, but our attention is given to certain things in our living through our everyday. So if our attention is given to imagination, it can be revealed as being important in revealing different senses of truth rather than like a reasoned scientific model of truth. So phenomenology gives us the tools to see that imagination, again, reveals a different sense of truth in perception itself, because it actually says something about the world. And so that is good, but ultimately what, especially Heidegger's phenomenology tends to rely on is that Dasein, which is the human subject for him, is the revealer, the primary component of truth. So he still puts humanity in the most important role in all of nature. So how are we to think of animals and their capacities more critically? And my answer is kind of like starting with this biologist who was writing around the time of Heidegger. His first book came out in 1934. His name is Jakob von Uexel. I can't pronounce that name very well. He recognized the importance of acknowledging animals as having a Newton belt, or basically their own subjective perceptual worlds, where they, just like Heideggerian phenomenology, have a concern with and engagement with their environments. So, in his observations of magical realities, and he names the name magical. The title may be misleading because magical just means for him because we don't have access to these life worlds, and in fact, that in itself becomes the reason why we should respect them, because they're not ours, and any attempt at explaining their perceptual worlds is anthropomorphic in itself. So, he states, each and every subject lives in a world in which there are only subjective realities, and the environments themselves represent only subjective realities. And this may seem to lead to an extreme version of relativism, but I think it actually leads to an inherent, well, it could be argued, I don't know if it could be argued well, maybe radical relativism is a source of a good overarching ethical respect for all things in nature. But, so, moving on, he demonstrates on his studies that, and he also, just like Aristotle in the history, gives animals imagination. And he does, what I really like about him and his examples is he uses like ticks, so really simple animals that you would not even think, so insects, which may not have as much capacity as, say, like an orca whale or something like that for moving in their environment, or what we consider intelligence, still have these little subjective worlds, and we should respect and treat them give all that inherent respect because of the fact that they navigate with concern just like we do. So let's skip that. But the animal imagination plays an important role in their survival, but also in what I think this kind of study could lead to is a study of play. And I think play becomes really important because play is not for the sake of just survival or shelter, and it functions with the imagination. So that's kind of like the sequel if I was to think about this some more. But so the basic point there is that imagination is not exclusive to humans, and that this creates subjects in animals themselves and plants. He doesn't really talk about plants, but that's a whole other issue. So environments are highly complex systems of interaction and perception for him, and this means that given the concern of animals and the perceptual capacities, animals have meaning, or at least he believes that animals make meaning. So in a phenomenological way, they guide themselves through the world and things are significant to them. And they're concerned with their lives. And so this means that that hierarchy that we originally had of human beings, well, if animals make meaning, then what does it mean to destroy something that has significance for its own self? If it's a subject with meaning-making significance, then it inherently has a capacity to strive to live, to want to live, and to enjoy living itself. So to think of ourselves as inherently given that and only ourselves is wrong. And a lot of philosophers will not give animals any sort of credence like that. Even phenomenologists, like for big ones, Heidegger, well, he was also a Nazi, so there's a whole balance there. But yeah, and try not to talk about that with Heidegger. It has to be talked about. So imagination basically gives again, I'm just kind of repeating myself, but it gives animals that link for us to make that ethical claim and deconstruct our own hierarchy. So this is kind of an opening, looking at animals in this way through Uxel, and actually there's a lot of recent work being done by scientists in Persian semiology right now, that the biosemiotics, that is exploring the science systems of animals, so exploring this idea more in depth. But what does this mean for respect and ethics? So obviously the hierarchy, opening up your consciousness and radicalizing it to these kinds of ideas as a human being is about all we can do based on Husserl's theory, because we can never know their worlds, but we have to have inherently a respect for them. So, and this also means that rather than thinking of animals on a hierarchical spectrum, think of it as difference and degrees of difference. So it's kind of combining some theories of Derrida and Spinoza to make that claim. But ultimately, the problem is the domination of nature has blinded us to an important ethical ought, or capacity for respect of the life worlds of other animals. So where does this leave us? And I think this leads us to a bigger problematic of capitalism itself, and what breeds, what gets repeated over and over again. Catholicism, Catholicism, and theology. I think that kind of inheritance just make us do the same. So how do we approach that? Like I said before, biosemiotics is something that's in science itself, but I think I'm really enjoying right now because these are scientists coming from backgrounds where they even take down to the cellular level as having their own subjective move outs and moving with some kind of significance. But I don't want to answer that question, but I think nowadays, at least in the academy, it's an interdisciplinary question that transcends any kind of one discipline. I just concentrated on the theoretical side of it. So ultimately, recognizing the imagination as an important factor in fostering respect for all subjective life is a key in beginning to appreciate and understand animals my computer broke, so I had to write all my notes down. As equal beings with, and I have really bad handwriting, with different ideas of perceptual capacities. Thus, different animal ethics entails obliterating the hierarchy that is promoted and privileging the human faculty of reason. And I didn't really touch on that I said at the beginning, I'm going to come back to it since, I still have some time. Okay. So I guess I'll do this completely informally now because I exhausted what I have. So my main concern recently has been the Cartesian framework in philosophy and how Cartesianism has led over to our conception of animals. So for Descartes, you have it's a mechanistic interpretation of everything outside of the human capacity of reason. So this is like the extreme of human reason valuing just reason and nothing else outside the world. So this completely obliterates what Husserl says. So you have extension, which is just everything, including animals, the world itself outside of our own minds. It's just a mechanism, it's a machine, just like a computer. So animals are just automatons moved by, what Descartes calls fluids. So that kind of conception, and a lot of philosophers have been working on this, but I think it really is an astute point about modernity, how much Descartes bleeds into our own, and I don't want to say scientific culture, because a lot of scientists have moved away from Descartes. I want to say our everyday conception of the world and capitalism itself, and what we think of in an ordinary conception of science. So someone who's not a scientist, what they think of science and its promises is mechanistic. So in order to give animals their place as subjects, I think that ultimately and primarily the Cartesian model, at least in theory, in the realm of theory, is what first needs to be exploded, in a sense, to make room for these alternative theories. And there are people who have done work on this, so, but it's a very minority, I think. To rethink ethics, we have to extend this to the common conception of breaking hierarchies in the theoretical realm. And I think that's where I
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Can you hear us?
I can hear you now.
How about now? Can you hear us now? No?
You want me to call you back?
Yeah. Can you hear?
All right.
How about now? Can you hear me
All
now?
right.
Yeah?
No,
No?
no voice. No voice, no.
What about now? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, so you can only hear us if we don't plug you in. They can see you. How about, so you can hear us if the volume's not, let me try one more thing. How about now? Yes? Can you hear me now? No. What about now?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of little holes on the side. Cool. All right, does anyone have questions for any of the speakers?
I do. I have for both.
Can you hear Kim?
Can I hear Kim?
Yeah.
Hi, Dylan.
Can you move? If she speaks loud, I can hear her.
Dylan,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yeah,
You're making us jealous.
I can. Well, I mean, it's Saturday night in rural Japan.
Okay. Okay, so I have a question for you and Stephen, but I'll start with you.
Yeah.
I know you probably didn't have time to get to it, but I was interested when you said, the dichotomy between how the males reacted and the females. And you said a lot of the male students used pseudoscience or like no citations at all. So I'm curious, what was their pseudoscience? Is it just like random things they find on the internet, or what was their justification? Where do you think that justification was coming from for knocking the vegan diet or whatever?
Yeah. So part of what should probably be addressed too is that the entire course we had an issue with students not citing properly. It's hard to say why that was the case. When we said we're gonna dock points if you don't cite, and we did, and there were students that literally failed papers because they refused to properly cite an attribute, and yet it kept going on. The pseudoscience though, it wasn't though they were actually trying. It wasn't like they had actually read something. It was more just offhand. It was sort of like, the effects of the Got Milk campaign in America, for instance. Everybody in America believes milk is good for their bones when it's not. And it was a lot similar to that. A lot of people assume that Japan doesn't have that, but Japan has a very big agriculture lobby, and it really has influenced their perception, I believe. The pseudoscience particularly, it boiled down to needing protein, was the big one, needing protein. Humans were also seen as, they said omnivore, yet what they meant by omnivore was clearly that humans needed meat also. Canine teeth came up, of course. But yeah, I mean, I have, again, it's in the longer paper, but basically, a lot of what it came down to was stuff like milk and protein. So,
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question. Can you hear me?
whoever's talking, sorry.
Okay. So my follow-up question is, you talked about gender differences and gender. Can you hear me now? My follow-up question is,
Okay.
you talked about gender differences, and right now you're talking about these sort of, and this is interesting with the other talks and the reliance on kind of how the way we philosophize about individuals is always, there's often this return to biology, right? So
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and then you talk about women feeling guilt, and I don't know about the cultural gender differences, so I'm just going off of what I know on the literature on gender differences of animals in the U.S., but I'm wondering if the females were more likely to express guilt and the males were more likely to try to use some sort of quote-unquote rational sort of arguments for, because like the movie's not even about eating meat, so if everyone's going to that, how are they justifying it? And were males more likely to try to use this biological rationality to justify the argument?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways too, I mean, I don't know how to put it, but I think at the end of the day too, you can't overlook that essentially you have this unit and you've got me and Darren standing up there teaching everybody an approach to animal otherness in film. And obviously, you know, I fit the stereotype of, you know, radical punk vegan or whatever. I've got hair, I've got the piercings. I mean, and Darren, for them, he's open about his health issues, and part of why he became vegetarian, I'm sure you wouldn't mind me telling you this, is he's allergic to the protein of animals, actually. And I mean, he is an ethical vegetarian now, but I don't think you can escape that. And I think between that, and I think between the fact that I told them the standpoint the authors were coming from, and we were open about that. I mean, both from the standpoint of critical animal studies, it would be disingenuous to not tell them that, and I mean, they figure it out. And so I think, you know, obviously you have to look at it in the framing of they're looking at consumption, and it became about diet. And I think it was stunningly similar to America and Europe, whatever, in that, yes, the males did resort to a biological approach, and the female students expressed guilt. And the female students were more likely to take a holistic view of the film and actually address otherness. A number of them really did address otherness, and there were several female papers that were really impacted by the film, and they really said, I see what this is about. I see that, you know, what is so bad about otherness. This film has made me realize why it's not okay to make anybody a second-class citizen. Look at, you know, these parallel forces dehumanize, and that dehumanization is the problem. And so they brought that in. But the female students in general reacted far more, whatever you want to call it, emotional or whatever. And I don't want to say it's an innate response. I want to say it's culture, and that came out in the responses. But like during the film, there were female students that got up and left because they were so upset and they were crying. And so I think that's the key difference, is that in the male papers you have this biological whatever, and in the female papers you had more of an engagement with it, and you had them bringing in sources from their other classes and whatever. And so I hope that answers the question.
Yep. So I have a question, if that's okay. Dylan's not going to hear it, but is that okay?
Ken's going to ask Stephen a question, but we don't know if you'll be able to hear it. Just drink your wine.
That's so cool. Well, first I had a comment and then a question. When you were talking about the imagination and how low the imagination, I mean, Aristotle might have had a different view, but I'm thinking of, after the rationalist tradition, I've done work with, in modernism, from the literature perspective, with the surrealists, and their whole goal was to make the world of dream and creation and imagination, like André Breton, Georges Bataille, to say that that is as real as the waking world. So that's more of a comment, like, I think, if you pursued this, or maybe you've already looked into it, I think the work, because they were philosophers, activists, and artists, so they would fit in with what you're doing. They really challenged that notion and made creativity and the imagination almost, they had their own problems with sexism, of course, but they made it almost higher than rationality. And, so that's just a comment that you might find interesting. And then, I don't know, I'm really taken by this. I'm going to read this book, and because I haven't read it, I'm wondering, because I had talked in my presentation about philosophers who came to these ethical conclusions but didn't seem to act on it, and I'm wondering if this gentleman's findings, from what you could tell, did it lead to any ethical conclusions or reconsideration, or like, this is how then animals should be treated?
I think with him, he is, I want to put him into a historical trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, that field I mentioned, biosemiology, started with him, and then I get his son and a couple other, I think, Norwegian biologists started to look at biology in the 60s and 70s and 80s from this perspective and building on this perspective. The ethical implications, especially with the deep ecology movement, they kind of became intertwined with deep ecology. In
So the
certain
deep
respects.
ecologists started using that work. Okay.
Yeah, and I know especially Foucault is familiar with his work.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of philosophers in Europe were influenced by him and his son, and it kind of was this intersecting thing. So the ethics came later. He doesn't necessarily address, it seems implicit in this reading, like almost like, okay, well now that you've treated animals as subjects, perceptual subjects, then you kind of have to treat them with
It
respect.
seems, a bit natural.
I think that his life was maybe succumb to the same kind of critique you had of the atheists. So I don't remember though about the historical details of it. But for example, even you can see how easy it is to succumb to that kind of rationale, because someone as influenced, like Heidegger was really influenced by his biology, and Heidegger was a Nazi. So there's a perfect example of someone who did not follow their ethical implications. And that happens all the time in philosophy in general, especially I think in American. But I see that in the academy all the time. In my own department, people who lecture on ethics and don't take it seriously, it feels like you should be led to some sort of like critical route, and then you don't follow through. But that's why you have people in philosophy, I guess, who turn into like Rancière, like turn that whole hatred of the academy itself into a critical system. But yeah, that's a long answer. And
No, it's good.
also on the surrealist and stuff, I think that's a very good import and thing to think about. And I'm almost wondering how psychoanalysis, because they were heavily influenced by Freud and Freudian psychoanalysis, how that kind of plays into the image, I think with two animals, how the unconscious and how that functions in an animal. I mean, we could never really know ultimately, but I think that'd be an interesting kind of intersection, like the unconscious imagination and animal rights.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. I don't know if anyone does work on that, but
You got it. We have it on tape.
Dylan, can you hear me?
What?
Someone,
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you
Okay.
great.
I have a question regarding, so you talked about how
I'm sorry, could you move closer to the laptop?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, thanks.
So you talked about how some of the things that came out of the papers, especially written by the females in your class, talked about the different cultural systems of oppression that they felt they were under that prohibited them from fully becoming vegan or vegetarian. Can you speak to that a little more? Because I'm really interested in it. And then you also mentioned that you'd be interested in doing like a program that kind of explored that more in other cultures and explored the view of animals in other cultures. Could you talk to that?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Something I want to quick note is about gender in the class. So right now, you're seeing a lot of stuff in Japan about rising ideas of GLBTQ and whatever. And so we did give the class the ability to say what their identifying gender was. And the only thing that they picked was on a gender binary. And so I want to quick note that. About the being caught up in cultural things, I think the class was the first exposure for a lot of these students to the idea of various forms of systematic oppression. And for a lot of them, this was jarring. There was, particularly in the feminism unit, there were a number of papers by female students that became very emotional and were very much about, there were several papers that were about specific episodes in their life where they had been stalked or harassed and were very emotional. And so I think in a very micro focus, it speaks to the importance of teaching courses like this in Japan and teaching, you know, how to view otherness, how to view systematic oppression. About the meat, I think it speaks to a general kind of environment in Japan in that if you try to imagine being vegan in America in maybe the 1940s, I mean, I know that seems extreme, but that's kind of where you're at. In the specific region that I'm in, that this class was taught in, it's difficult to be vegan. I pay through the roof for fresh produce right now. If you imagine pretty much any dish you probably cook that's vegan right now in America, you're not going to be able to do it in Japan for under $10. I mean, if I eat like an actual healthy, balanced dinner that I cook at home, it's over $10. And it's kind of unreal. A can of beans costs me over $3. And so it's really staggering. And there's been no work yet done to adapt a standard Japanese cuisine in a vegan way, right? So much of Japanese cuisine is reliant on fish, and people also oversimplify it and think that Japanese cuisine has remained static, and it really hasn't. A lot of young kids are used to eating a ton of meat, right? Especially the type of students that were in age in this group. When you're in high school in Japan, right, every night you're going to cram school, and you're probably eating away from your family. And most of what you're eating is junk food, right? You're eating at like McDonald's, you're eating at whatever you can get after you get out of school and go to cram school. And so a lot of kids in Japan now are accustomed to high-fat, high-protein diet, right? Because that's their options that they choose. That's the delicious food. Because, I mean, to be honest, really, a lot of Japanese food is really bland. Right? McDonald's has more flavor. And so there's that. And, you know, when you go out in Japan, right, a lot of the girls specifically, a lot of the idea of being a young girl in Japan is, and I mean, right now I am doing research on what does it mean to be vegetarian and female in Japan, right? And a lot of being out in public as a girl in Japan is centered on conspicuous consumption. And these girls, there's nowhere for them to eat that's vegetarian, right? Especially when they're operating on a liminal budget. And so you run into this problem where vegetarian cuisine now in Japan it's beyond the fad level that it's attained in America. it's popular among women that have a high level of disposable income because they're the group that's prone to care about this, and they're the only group that's prone to have the money to do that, right? Like lunch at the vegan restaurant in town here cost me $20. And so it's hard, and they're caught in this cultural environment where, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but it is really patriarchal here, right? And so it's hard to make these dietary choices. If you look at the research of Cudworth, who looks at the British condition of non-human animals and patriarchy, she talks about how women will buy meat mainly to cook for their husbands, not for themselves, but for their husbands. And that's very much the environment you have here. And meat is seen as sophisticated, it's seen as whatever. And it's, yeah, so there's that. And, I don't want to take up too much time, but I do think that, I have a marked interest now in light of this and in light of spending time in Japan and working with whoever else wants to on sort of a global look at how speciesism is constructed outside of America. Because I think in places, whether it's Japan, whether it's Africa, South America, you're having a collision between what was there before hyperglobalization and what's there after. And you have a really complex collision, especially in places like Japan, between ethical cultures opposed to eating meat, like Buddhism and Shintoism, and a collision between very practical concerns. It's economic. Meat is heavily subsidized by the government and Big A in Japan. And taste, right? Like, in Akita, where I am, right, like, the big thing is rice. Just straight white rice. It makes up the carb intake of the majority of meals. And when students go, and they go to McDonald's, they go to whatever, they're able to get these flavorful meals packed with fat that taste good to them. That's quite different than what they can get at home. And so you're having a rich collision between ethical values, and again, it's so indoctrinated at this point. Suicide food imagery, for instance, is far more prevalent here than America. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to elaborate on what I see as what needs to be a project to document speciesism in order to embark on a further project of actually critiquing it globally. And I think that needs to be people that do have power, such as myself. I can get grants, I can do whatever. And a lot of Japanese vegan and vegetarian groups can't do that. And so it needs to be those of us that do have, that do have the privilege, just like men helping feminism. It needs to be those of us that have the privilege helping those that want to embark on this critique of speciesism. Because there are people in Japan that want to do it. There's people in any part of the world you go to, there's people that want to critique speciesism and combat it. And the role of what I think an engaged critical animal studies scholar activist needs to be is to embark on empowering people that are living in, not living in, but situated in these cultures to help them to do what they want to do in the way of critique. Because there's phenomenal critique coming out of Japan, but it's very marginal and it's very hard to hear, right? Like when I was traveling just now and I picked up a children's book called I Ate a Life. And it's beautiful, and it's a great intersectional critique of eating animals. And so I think that's part of what I want this project to be, is I think critical animal studies needs to really look outside of just the Western Academy and look at how do we reach out to people that are doing this critical work and reaching to people, and what is their theory, what is their praxis, and how do we help them. So that's kind of what I'd say.
Thank you. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, for Kim. So I have been frustrated with a lot of the current atheist thinkers in similar ways. And
One sec, I'm sorry. if the question's for me, I'm gonna need somebody to repeat it to me or whoever's saying it to come closer.
No, it's
It's for Kim.
Okay, sorry.
But yeah, so I've been really, especially with people like Sam Harris and Dawkins, and I wanted you to talk a little bit more of your critique of them, but I just wanted to, so I also wanted to know if you talk about, one of my big criticisms I have of atheism right now is that there's no inherent critique of the structure of the idea of power and domination, even though domination comes from dominion, at least as a concept, and what I generally argue is that without that critique of domination and power, it relies on liberal values, which inherently then moves it back into a Judeo-Christian framework, and therefore it reinforces a lot of these kind of Christian ideas through its own unwillingness to critique power and capitalism inherently. So that,
Yeah.
and also what else you kind of say about like Sam Harris and Dawkins and them.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you that they don't do that. And I talk about it almost tangentially to the book, but I felt it had to be noted that the atheist movement in the West has been critiqued by critical race scholars. Shakivu Hutchinson is a name that comes to mind, and Annalise Spanza, who did a blurb for my book, comes to mind as well. These are women of color who are saying this, it's almost like when you think of rationalist philosophy, these traditions, and even the ones that were based in religion, it kind of looks the same. Very highly educated white men being, telling the rest, it sounds like religion too, telling the rest of the world how to behave and what works and what doesn't. There is, and of course, I would say that like Sam Harris, I talk about Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins, but mostly Dawkins and Harris, and they are revolutionary thinkers in one way, but I wouldn't say they're radical at all. They might have a radical view on, well, I don't even think it's radical not to believe in God. It's maybe getting more, it's easier to admit that you don't. But they, and then they've also, of course, especially Harris, they've actually been accused, and maybe rightfully so. I kind of go, depending on what I read, I might change my mind, but rightfully accused of Islamophobia with some of their critiques of Islam as if it is some aberration of religion, as if it had some extremist behavior hasn't happened and doesn't still happen in other religious traditions. So I think, which is would be a critique of them. Yes, they don't. That's missing, and I don't think they care really. I think so. As far as the other things I critique about them, as far as Dawkins, he's been called out before publicly by Peter Singer in an interview that I cite. And there's interviews on YouTube, The Genius of Darwin, where actually, to quote Singer, he says it's vestiges of religious belief that cause you to look at animals in this way still. And Richard Dawkins is just very kind of blasé, like in such a, he's so polite, more moral person, and I'm willing to, we would never say that in the case of like, racism or something, like you're such a less racist person, but I'm okay with my level of racism, but it's, and it's a very polite exchange, but he's been called out. I actually have a little inside scoop that in his inner circle, I don't know if it's true, but somebody, animal rights activist was at a dinner, a special dinner, and gave a copy of my book to his people. I don't know if he'd read it, if he would even care, because I think he already came to the conclusions. So I critique that. And then as far as Sam Harris, I mean, I'll just take a few minutes. He was really, his work was very upsetting to me, because he has a book called The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Values. He says some great things about other species. He calls out a geneticist named Francis Collins, saying that Collins is wrong to argue that morality does not show up in other species, and he's like, it shows up in dogs, primates, mice. No, morality, that's it, you know, we're anthropocentric, but care for others, you know, shows up in other species. And then in this, I'll just end on this, because it was the most frustrating thing about his book. He talks about factory farms very briefly, and he says, his ultimate conclusion is they are ethically indefensible. But his reason for continuing to eat meat and for not challenging the animal industrial complex, when we think of his whole basis is rationality. That's what he does, ration. And he says because it's possible that human life is not the apex of life on Earth, and this is all on a footnote, he doesn't even include it in the text, because someday super beings might come down and use us as a food source, and he would be okay with that. That's why it's okay to eat animals. I mean, talk about bad arguments for eating. And this is like Sam Harris, like, you know, neurologist, philosopher, seems like he's got his shit together, and this is the best that he could come up with. But I actually think these bad arguments, which I wanted to expose in the book, if you know, are good, because it's showing that the only way, if you live in a world, you know, because Dylan brought that up too, if you can make these choices, it's almost like your only way out of it are really bad arguments that aren't justifiable. So those are the two who I really kind of go into, because they've made an attempt to address other species, and I think they ultimately failed.
What
I
are you
should just
asking?
have something just to
Yeah.
add to this discussion too. Do you also, because I'm thinking that there's a certain, like, you know, like badge, putting a badge on it, like the neoliberal nihilism when you are someone like Richard Dawkins. Like, he doesn't have to care because he's atheist.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you could talk about that.
Well, I mean, I have to say, if looking at both of them, you know, I would say that Harris has taken a more, like a less nihilistic perspective, where well, that's the point of his book. He lays out how atheism leads to moral progress. Michael Shermer, in a book he just published called The Moral Arc, does the same thing, shows how atheism, that they are showing concern for the damage religion does. So that religion is not just, oh, I'm not religious, it is a problem that's damaging. But I think you're right, and I've read a lot of Dawkins, but he doesn't necessarily show that that sense of concern like Harris does for the environment. I mean, Dawkins mentions environmental movement stuff. He doesn't seem to show that same concern. Whether it's about his being an atheist or not, I don't know if there's an association there. But I would say that that Harris maybe sets up a better model for calling out religion as being harmful, and actually showing, like, how can we fix this? Well, Dawkins just seems to want to just dismiss religion without saying, okay, what do we do after we dismiss religion? How do we fix these problems?
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, so you were talking afterwards, and I got this during your talk too, on deep ecology, and I was wondering how where you're going right now differs from deep ecology, or what it adds to it, or if it's actually heavily influenced by it.
I think just to, like, also, since we're running out of time, a briefer answer is the work, the interdisciplinary. I mean, deep ecology is interdisciplinary too, but I guess that there's a very hardcore right now movement in biology itself going on, like, so really founding things in, like, at the cellular level that I think is, like, different. And I think also with the richer, I mean, I don't know. I think that's a good question, but I definitely is parallel. I wouldn't try to, like, make any claims that, you know, I'm doing something extremely different. They have the same kind of concerns.
Yeah, it seems like someone like David Abrams really is like, if there's a Venn diagram of what you're doing in deep ecology, it seems to be someone who might have both.
Yeah, for my master's
talking about deep ecology, I got this spark of hope, because I feel like when people talk about atheism and when people talk about philosophy, when we talk about issues like Dylan was talking about rational, emotional, we're just reifying the patriarchal base and knowledge system. When you started talking about deep ecology, I started seeing a way forward, and I'm interested in whether you problematize this idea of rational as stagnant and as like this idea that like for every drop of rationality you take away a drop of emotionality, as if they're like completely separate things, right? Which obviously they're not. So did you guys find any great feminist thinkers who are adding to sort of the puzzles that you're looking at that have a different way of framing things but maybe aren't as big in the fields that you're talking about?
I know one in philosophy. She doesn't write necessarily on ecology. She always alludes to it. She's Martha Nussbaum.
Oh,
I've read a lot of her stuff, and she's always kind of concerned about those questions of ecology
And I think, in case other people want, like, you probably know, are aware too, I think some of the, I have, some critiques of everything, of course, but I think the feminist care tradition really has, Marty Keel, I think has had some of the best critiques of rationality as almost being an illusion, in a sense.
But she doesn't become an atheist thinker, right? Like, are there people in the atheist community who are talking to this? I mean, there's you, right? Are there other thinkers in the atheist community who are saying these things, but maybe they are erased because the atheist community is so masculine, male-dominated, patriarchal, and has so many problems in that way?
Well, that's a good question, and I'd say, unless I'm missing something, which is possible because it is so male-dominated, and one of the biggest female atheists is Ali Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She is she was a Muslim. There's like a fatwa on her head, but she's accused of being extremely enmeshed in patriarchy, like with her accused of Islamophobia and things like that. And I would think it's such a heavily science-based that I think that's why voices like that would look at emotion and ration differently are not even silenced. They don't get a chance to even, like, there's not a field open to them. So it's a place for growth for sure.
So we have 2 minutes left. Good ending a little early.
Yeah, I have to go to the bathroom. I gotta go for a while.
Thank you guys very much.
Yeah, this is great. Here. Thank you, Dylan. If you could just keep that up, because I'm gonna have to get lost on there somehow. I'm not gonna be as good as you were.
Can you hear us?
Is that great? Okay.
All right, I'm gonna say bye. It was good to see you.
Yeah, it was great to see you.
All right, when are you coming back to Minnesota?
July, August.
Party. Okay.
Yeah, really.
All right. Well, you did the party started early for us today. Bye.
Bye, Dylan.
Bye.
So leave this up.
Yeah. I'm gonna share the next one here.
Can I see your schedule?
Oh,
Do
actually,
you
I'm
want these
not.
lights
Wait.
off, or do you want some more?
Yeah, the light would be, and then we'll just, I think Anthony turned them off for filming purposes. I'm not.
I turned them off for seeing him purposes.